The evening sun painted long shadows across Mountain View Diner's parking lot as Captain Jaiho Park's fingers traced the familiar patterns of his white cane. His daughter, Hanul, walked beside him with practiced ease. Her steps matched perfectly to his. Every Friday at 6 o'clock, they came to this same diner, sat at the same booth, and shared the same peaceful moment together. 3 steps to the door. "Dad," Hanul said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that had become his guiding light since the accident. Jiho nodded, counting the steps in his mind. The door chimed as they entered, bringing with it the sweet smell of fresh coffee and Mrs. Lee's famous apple pie. "Ah, my favorite customers." Mrs. Lee's cheerful voice called out from behind the counter. The sound of her comfortable shoes squeaked against the clean floor as she hurried to greet them. "Your usual booth is ready, Captain Park." Jaiho smiled in the direction of her voice. Even after losing his sight 5 years ago, he could picture Mrs. Lee's kind face perfectly. The crow's feet around her eyes that deepened when she smiled, the silver streaks in her dark hair that she refused to dye, and the small birthmark near her left ear. "Thank you, Mrs. Lee," he replied, letting Hanul guide him to their booth. His hands found the familiar leather seat, worn smooth from years of use. The table's edge had a small chip on his side, a landmark he used to orient himself in this space that had become like a second home. Hanul sat across from him, the soft rustle of her jacket telling him she was settling in. "The sunset is beautiful today, Dad," she said, continuing their tradition of being his eyes. "The clouds are pink and orange, like watercolors spreading across the sky." Jaiho closed his unseeing eyes, remembering the sunsets he used to watch from his military post in Afghanistan. "Just like the ones we used to see in Kandahar," he said quietly. His daughter made a small sound of agreement, knowing how precious these memories were to him. Before the IED blast that took his sight, Jaiho had been known as Eagle Eye in his unit. His ability to spot danger from miles away had saved countless lives. Now, at 52, his other senses had sharpened to compensate for his lost vision. He could tell from the slight change in air pressure that someone had opened the diner's door, from the pattern of footsteps how many people had entered, and from the subtle shifts in conversation, whether they were regulars or newcomers. Mrs. Lee brought their usual orders without them having to ask. Black coffee and bulgogi burger for Jaiho, green tea, and kimchi fries for Hanul. "I added extra pickles to your burger, Captain," Mrs. Lee said, placing the plates down with practiced care, making sure to tell him exactly where each item was positioned. "And Hanul, I made the kimchi extra spicy, just how you like it." As they began to eat, Jaiho couldn't help but feel proud of his daughter. Hanul had followed in his military footsteps, but in her own way. While he had been a frontline soldier, she had chosen military intelligence, becoming one of the youngest officers in her unit to receive a commendation for excellence in cyber operations. "How was work today?" he asked, knowing she could only share general details about her current civilian job in cybersecurity. Hanul swallowed a bite of her fries before answering. "Interesting. We had a new client come in, a small bank worried about their security systems." She paused, and Jaiho heard the smile in her voice. "They thought their systems were unbreakable. It took me less than an hour to find 3 major weaknesses." Jaiho chuckled. "Still keeping the bad guys on their toes, I see." His daughter had always been brilliant with computers, even as a child. While other kids were playing video games, she was learning how to program them. Her skills had served her well in military intelligence, and now in her civilian career. The comfortable buzz of the diner wrapped around them as they ate and talked. Jaiho could hear the cook in the kitchen calling out orders, the clink of coffee cups being refilled, and the quiet conversations of other diners. He had learned to paint pictures in his mind using sounds, smells, and memories. "Remember when you were little," Jaiho said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "and you used to come to the base with me on family days. You were more interested in the communication equipment than the tanks and helicopters." Hanul laughed. "The other kids thought I was weird, but Colonel Song let me sit in the communications room and taught me about encryption codes. That's probably what started it all." Jai-ho reached across the table, and Hae-Newell met his hand halfway, squeezing it gently. They had always been close, but after losing his sight, their bond had grown even stronger. When his wife, Hae-Newell's mother, passed away from cancer 2 years before the IED incident, they had become each other's whole world. "Dad," Hae-Newell said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've been meaning to tell you something." She paused, and Ji-ho waited patiently, hearing her take a deep breath. "I've been offered a position with a special cybersecurity task force. It would mean working closely with military intelligence again, but from the civilian side." Ji-ho felt his chest swell with pride. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart. I know how much you've missed working with your old unit. There's more," she continued. "Commander Sunmai recommended me for the position. She says they need someone with both military experience and private sector knowledge." The name brought back memories. Commander Sunmai had been Hae-Newell's commanding officer in the military intelligence unit, a tough but fair leader who had helped shape his daughter's career. Sunmai always could spot talent, Ji-ho said warmly. "When do you start?" "Next month." "But Dad," Hae-Newell's voice carried a hint of worry. "It might mean some irregular hours. I don't want to disrupt our routine." Ji-ho shook his head firmly. "Don't worry about that. Your career is important. We'll make it work, just like we always have." He smiled, tapping his white cane gently against the booth. "Besides, I'm not completely helpless. I can always get Mrs. Lee to deliver if needed." From across the diner, Mrs. Lee called out, "You heard that right, Captain. I'll personally bring your bulgogi burger if Hae-Newell is busy saving the world." The whole diner erupted in warm laughter, and Ji-ho felt the familiar sense of belonging wash over him. This place, these people, they had become family after his injury. When he had first lost his sight, he had struggled with depression, feeling like he had lost not just his vision but his purpose. It was Hae-Newell and this community that had helped him find his way back to life. As they finished their meal, the sun had fully set, and the evening crowd was starting to fill the diner. Ji-ho could hear more voices, more footsteps, more life flowing around them. He didn't need eyes to know that this moment, sitting across from his daughter in their favorite diner, was perfect just as it was. Little did they know that this peaceful evening routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test their strength, courage, and the bonds they had forged both in and out of uniform. The peaceful atmosphere in Mountain View Diner changed the moment the motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Hae-Newell noticed the change first, her military training making her instantly alert to the loud engines and heavy footsteps approaching the diner's entrance. Across from her, her father's head tilted slightly, his way of showing he had noticed something was different. The door chimed 5 times in quick succession as the bikers entered. The normal dinner chatter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Hae-Newell watched as 5 men in black leather jackets with red dragon patches walked in, their boots leaving dirt marks on Mrs. Lee's clean floor. The leader, a tall man with a prominent scar across his left cheek, scanned the diner with cold eyes. "Dad," Hae-Newell said quietly, keeping her voice steady, "we have some new visitors." Ji-ho nodded almost imperceptibly. His fingers remained relaxed around his coffee cup, but Hae-Newell knew her father well enough to recognize his tactical assessment of the situation. Even without sight, the former captain was counting footsteps, tracking movements, and building a mental map of potential threats. The leader, who Hae-Newell would later learn was called Taiwan, walked to the counter where Mrs. Lee stood nervously wiping the same spot over and over with her cloth. The other 4 bikers spread out across the diner, their presence causing other customers to hunch over their meals and avoid eye contact. "Nice place you have here," Taiwan said, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. "Shame if anything were to happen to it." He ran a finger along the clean counter, leaving a dirty smudge. "Accidents happen all the time, don't they, Mrs. Lee?" Mrs. Lee's hand trembled as she put down her cleaning cloth. "Please," she said softly. "I run a simple business. I don't want any trouble." Hanul felt her jaw tighten. She had seen this before. Criminals preying on hard-working people, demanding protection money. Her hand instinctively moved toward her phone, but she waited, gathering information first, just as her training had taught her. One of the bikers, a shorter man with numerous tattoos covering his neck, walked past their booth. He stopped, did a double take, and then smiled unpleasantly at Hanul. "Hey, boss," he called out. "Come check this out." Taiwan turned away from Mrs. Lee and walked toward their booth. Hanul could smell leather and cigarette smoke as he approached. Her father remained perfectly still, his unseeing eyes focused straight ahead, his white cane resting against the booth's edge. Well, Taiwan said, placing both hands on their table and leaning forward. "What do we have here?" "A pretty lady." And he paused, noticing Jaiho's unfocused eyes and the white cane, a blind old man. "We're just finishing our dinner," Hanul said calmly, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in business meetings. "I'm sure you gentlemen have other establishments to visit." Taiwan laughed, and his gang members joined in. "Hear that? She thinks we're gentlemen." He pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat down, far too close to Hanul. "Actually, we're going to stay right here. Maybe you'd like to join us for a drink." Jaiho spoke for the first time, his voice steady and commanding despite his vulnerable position. "My daughter and I are not interested in your company." The gang leader's face darkened. "Nobody asked you, old man." He turned back to Hanul. "What do you say, sweetheart? Ditch the old-timer and come have some real fun." Hanul felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same feeling she used to get during complex military operations. She looked directly into Taiwan's eyes. "I believe my father made our position clear." At another table, a young couple quietly got up and hurried toward the exit. One of the bikers blocked their path. "Nobody leaves," he announced. "Not until we finish our business here." Mrs. Lee had moved to the kitchen doorway, her face pale with worry. The cook, an old man named Mr. Song, stood beside her with a large knife in his hand, though he looked unsure about what to do with it. Taiwan leaned even closer to Hanul. "You don't understand how this works, do you? We're the wild dragons. When we come to a neighborhood, people learn to respect us. Your father might not be able to see what's happening, but surely you can see where this is going." Hanul glanced at her father, seeing the slight tension in his jaw, the only sign that he was preparing for whatever might come next. She had seen that look before, back when he was still an active duty captain. It was the look he got when he was about to take control of a situation. "I see exactly where this is going," Hanul replied, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "And I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully." The gang members burst out laughing again. One of them slapped the counter, making Mrs. Lee jump. Taiwan's face split into a cruel smile. "Or what? You're blind, Daddy's going to stop us." Jaiho's hand moved slightly on the table, a subtle signal that Hanul recognized from their military days. Wait for the right moment. She kept her attention focused on Taiwan, but her awareness extended to the whole diner. 4 gang members spread out. 2 exits. 8 civilian customers. Mrs. Lee and Mr. Song in the kitchen doorway. All the variables that would matter in the next few minutes. "You know what?" Taiwan said, standing up suddenly. "I'm tired of being nice. Here's how this is going to work. Mrs. Lee is going to start paying us protection money. And you," he pointed at Hanul, "are going to join us for a ride. If you're lucky, we'll bring you back tomorrow." Hanul saw Mrs. Lee cover her mouth in horror. The other customers seemed frozen in their seats. Her father's hand had tightened almost imperceptibly around his white cane. "That's not going to happen," Hanul said, her voice now carrying the authority that had once commanded military intelligence operations. She reached for her phone, maintaining eye contact with Taiwan. What are you going to do? Call the police? He laughed. By the time they get here. No, Hey Newell interrupted, already dialing a number she knew by heart. Not the police. She pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear, still staring directly at Todd 1. This is Agent Park. Authorization code 72 Delta 9. I need immediate assistance at Mountain View Diner. Code red. The line clicked instantly, and a crisp voice responded. Understood, Agent Park. Assets are 4 minutes out. Tai One's face showed the first flicker of uncertainty. What game are you playing? Newell put her phone down on the table. No game. But I suggest you and your friends stay right where you are. Things are about to get very interesting. One of the gang members moved toward her threateningly, but Tai One held up his hand, suddenly wary. Something in Hey Newell's confident demeanor had given him pause. He looked between her and her blind father, trying to understand what he had missed. The diner fell into tense silence as they waited. Hey Newell could feel the seconds ticking by, knowing exactly what was coming. Her father sat calmly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the same smile she had seen him wear before every successful military operation. In the distance, they could hear vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles, moving fast and in formation. Tai One's face lost some of its color as he recognized the sound of professional drivers, not local police. Newell allowed herself a small smile. You should have left when you had the chance. The sound of vehicles pulling into the diner's parking lot grew louder. Through the windows, Hey Newell could see black SUVs positioning themselves in a practiced formation, blocking all possible escape routes. The Wild Dragons gang members exchanged nervous glances as headlights flooded the diner's interior. Tide One tried to maintain his tough appearance, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. What kind of game are you playing? Who did you call? You wanted to know what I see. Hey Newell said calmly. I see 5 men who made a very poor choice tonight. She glanced at her watch. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. They're ahead of schedule. The diner's door opened, and Commander Sunmai walked in, dressed in civilian clothes, but carrying herself with unmistakable military bearing. Behind her, highly trained operators in plain clothes took up strategic positions around the diner. To regular customers, they might have looked like ordinary people, but Hey Newell recognized the subtle signs of their training. The way they moved, the positions they chose, the silent communication between team members. Agent Park, Commander Sunmai said, nodding to Hey Newell. Then she turned to Jaiho. Captain Park, good to see you again, sir. Jaiho smiled in the direction of her voice. Commander Sunmai, your team is as punctual as ever. Tai One's face had lost its remaining color. Listen, there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Commander Sunmai interrupted. We've been tracking the Wild Dragons for months. Protection rackets, assault, drug trafficking. Quite a resume you've built. She turned to one of her team members. Do we have visual confirmation on all targets? Yes, Commander, the agent replied. 5 subjects, matching known Wild Dragons members. Tai-One Kim, wanted in 3 districts. The tattooed gang member who had first noticed Hey Newell made a sudden move toward the kitchen exit. He didn't make it 2 steps before 2 plainclothes operators had him in a professional hold, face down on the floor. The other gang members raised their hands, finally understanding the severity of their situation. Mrs. Lee watched from behind the counter, her eyes wide with amazement. Mr. Song stood beside her, still holding his kitchen knife, though it now seemed comically unnecessary given the quiet efficiency of the Special Forces team. You know, Jaiho said conversationally, his unseeing eyes turned toward Taiwan's general direction. When I was a captain, I learned that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who look threatening. He picked up his white cane, using it to stand up with practiced ease. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones you underestimate. Like my daughter, for instance. Newell watched as Commander Sunmi's team efficiently secured the gang members. Each operator moved with precise, rehearsed movements, causing minimal disruption to the diner while ensuring complete control of the situation. "Agent Park," Commander Sunmai said, turning back to Newell, "we'll need your statement for the official record. The wild dragons have been a priority target for our joint task force. Your call tonight gives us probable cause for multiple arrests." Taiwan, now in handcuffs, stared at Newell with a mixture of shock and anger. "You're a cop." "Not exactly," Newell replied. "I specialize in cyber intelligence. Your gang's activities caught our attention when you started using cryptocurrency for your protection money. Sloppy digital footprints." She shook her head. "The physical intimidation brought you to our attention, but your poor operational security made our job much easier." Commander Sunmei gestured to her team. "Clear the suspects out. Standard processing." She turned to the other customers in the diner. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disruption. You're free to go, but we'll need contact information for follow-up statements." As the gang members were let out, Mrs. Lee approached Newell and Jiho's table. "All this time," she said softly, "I had no idea. You've been protecting us." "The whole neighborhood," Commander Sunmei confirmed. "Agent Park's new position with our task force has been instrumental in tracking criminal organizations that target small businesses." She smiled, though tonight's direct intervention wasn't exactly part of the standard procedure. Jiho reached out, and Mrs. Lee grasped his hand. "You've taken care of us for years, Mrs. Lee," he said warmly. "Consider this repayment for all those extra pickles on my burgers." The tension in the diner gradually dissolved as Commander Sunmei's team efficiently processed the scene. Regular customers began sharing stories about other incidents involving the wild dragons, now feeling safe enough to speak up. Mr. Song proudly showed off his kitchen knife to one of the operators, who politely admired it while quietly encouraging him to put it away. Newell noticed her father's posture had relaxed, though he maintained his alert attention to the sounds around him. "You knew something like this might happen," she said to him quietly. "That's why you insisted on keeping our Friday dinner tradition, even after I mentioned my new job." Jiho smiled. "I may be blind, but I still know how to read a tactical situation. Small businesses being threatened, your new position with the task force, Commander Sunmei's involvement. It wasn't hard to figure out this diner might become a target." He reached across the table, and Newell took his hand. "Besides, we're better to confront criminals than in a place where we know every inch of the space, surrounded by people we trust." Commander Sunmei returned to their table after overseeing the preliminary processing. "The neighborhood should be significantly quieter now. We've had surveillance teams documenting the wild dragons' activities for weeks. Tonight's attempted intimidation gives us everything we need for multiple felony charges." "What about the other businesses they threatened?" Mrs. Lee asked, bringing fresh coffee to the table. "We'll need statements from everyone," Commander Sunmei explained. "Agent Park will coordinate with the civilian authorities. By this time tomorrow, every business owner in this district will know the wild dragons are no longer a threat." Newell looked around the diner, at the familiar faces of regular customers, at Mrs. Lee's relieved smile, at her father's proud expression, and at the professional operators who had responded so quickly to her call. The simple family diner had transformed into something else tonight, a demonstration that justice could still prevail when good people work together. "I think," Jiho said, reaching for his coffee cup with perfect accuracy, "this calls for a piece of Mrs. Lee's apple pie." Mrs. Lee hurried to get the pie, insisting it was on the house. As she served them, Commander Sunmei received a message on her secure phone. Her expression turned serious as she read it. "Agent Park," she said, "the initial data extraction from their phones confirms our suspicions. The wild dragons are connected to a larger criminal network. Your cyber expertise will be crucial for the next phase of this operation." Newell nodded, understanding the implications. Tonight's events were just the beginning of a larger mission. But as she sat across from her father in their familiar booth, Watching Mrs. Lee serve pie to the remaining customers and Commander Sun's team maintain their professional vigilance, she knew they had already won an important victory. The blind veteran and his daughter had turned their regular family dinner into a turning point in the neighborhood's fight against crime. And they had done it not with violence or intimidation, but with preparation, intelligence, and the strength of their community bonds. "You know what this means, don't you?" Jae-ho said with a slight smile. "Next Friday's dinner might be even more interesting." Han-Newell laughed, feeling the warmth of family, duty, and purpose wrap around her like a comfortable blanket. "As long as Mrs. Lee saves our booth, we'll be ready for whatever comes next." The next morning, Han-Newell sat in Commander Sun's secure briefing room, surrounded by monitors displaying data from the Wild Dragon's investigation. The events at Mountain View Diner had set off a chain reaction that was now revealing a complex network of criminal activities across the region. "The information extracted from their phones is remarkable," Commander Sunmi said, pointing to one of the screens. "Your father was right about the diner being the perfect location. We not only caught the local gang members, but also uncovered connections to 3 other criminal organizations." Han-Newell studied the network diagram on the main screen. Red lines connected different criminal groups, showing money transfers, communication patterns, and business relationships. The Wild Dragons were just one small part of a much larger operation. Their digital security was poor, Han-Newell noted, typing commands into her terminal. They used basic encryption, but left clear traces of their activities. Bank records, messages, meeting locations, it's all here. She paused, focusing on a particular data stream. "Look at this pattern. The protection money they collected wasn't just going into their accounts. They were transferring it to someone bigger." Commander Sunmi leaned forward, her expression serious. "Can you trace the final destination?" "I'm working on it," Han-Newell replied, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. "They tried to hide it behind multiple cryptocurrency transfers, but they made mistakes. Classic amateur moves." In another part of the building, interrogators were questioning the gang members. Taiwan had already started talking, hoping to make a deal. His tough exterior had crumbled when he learned the full extent of the operation he had stumbled into. Han-Newell's phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Lee. The diner owner had become an unexpected ally in their investigation, sharing information about other business owners who had been threatened. The community was finally speaking up, no longer afraid of the gang's retaliation. "Your father called earlier," Commander Sunmi mentioned, bringing 2 cups of coffee to the workstation. "He's quite proud, you know. Said he always knew you would find a way to protect people, just like he did." Han-Newell smiled, accepting the coffee. "He taught me that strength isn't always about physical power. Sometimes it's about being in the right place at the right time, with the right resources." A young analyst rushed into the room, holding a tablet. "Agent Park, Commander. We found something in the gang's messaging history. They were planning something big for next week. Multiple targets, coordinated attacks." Han-Newell pulled up the relevant data on her screen. The plan was clear now. The Wild Dragons had been preparing to launch a campaign of intimidation across the entire business district. Small restaurants, shops, and family-owned stores would have been hit simultaneously, creating a wave of fear that would make their protection racket even more effective. "They were going to start with the diner," Han-Newell said, reading through the messages. "They saw it as the heart of the neighborhood. If they could break Mrs. Lee's resistance, they thought others would fall in line quickly." Commander Sun's phone rang. After a brief conversation, she turned to Han-Newell with a satisfied expression. That was the prosecutor's office. They're fast-tracking the cases against the Wild Dragons. With the evidence we gathered, plus testimonies from business owners, they're looking at significant prison time. Throughout the day, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Han-Newell's cyber team traced money transfers, decoded encrypted messages, and mapped out the gang's entire operation. What had started as a confrontation in a family diner was expanding into one of the largest organized crime investigations in recent memory. In the early evening, Haynul took a break to visit her father at home. She found him in their small garden, tending to his herbs. Even without sight, he had learned to identify each plant by touch and smell, maintaining the garden with remarkable precision. "The prosecutors are impressed with the case," Haynul told him, sitting on the garden bench. "Commander Sunmei says it's going to make a real difference in the neighborhood." Jaiho smiled, his fingers gently touching the leaves of a basil plant. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest places, like a family diner where a blind veteran and his daughter have dinner every Friday. Haynul watched her father work in the garden, remembering how lost he had seemed after losing his sight. But he had adapted, found new ways to contribute, and never lost his sense of duty to others. His presence at the diner had been no accident. He had chosen to maintain that routine, knowing it would help protect the community he loved. "Mrs. Lee asked about you," Haynul said. "She's organizing a community meeting next week. Business owners want to set up a neighborhood watch program. They're calling it the Mountain View Protection Network." Jaiho chuckled. "Protection Network. Sounds more professional than a bunch of neighbors looking out for each other over coffee and pie." "That's exactly what makes it work," Haynul replied. "Real security isn't just about force or technology. It's about people connecting, sharing information, supporting each other." Her phone buzzed again. Another update from the investigation team. They had traced the cryptocurrency transfers to a larger criminal organization operating in the next province. What had started as a local gang takedown was evolving into an operation with national security implications. "You should go," Jaiho said, sensing her shift in attention. "The work isn't finished." Haynul stood, but paused before leaving. "Dad, about our Friday dinners." "We're not stopping them," Jaiho interrupted firmly. "Now more than ever, that diner needs its regulars. Besides," he added with a smile, "Mrs. Lee would never forgive us." Back at headquarters, Haynul rejoined Commander Sunmei and the investigation team. The monitors showed new data streams, more connections, and expanding networks of criminal activity. But now they had something they hadn't had before, a community ready to stand together against intimidation. The wild dragons thought they could exploit what they saw as weakness, Commander Sunmei observed, watching Haynul work. They never understood that sometimes the strongest defense comes from the most unexpected places. Haynul nodded, thinking about her father in his garden, Mrs. Lee in her diner, and all the other community members who had found their courage to speak up. The investigation would continue, reaching into darker corners of organized crime, but the foundation of their success had been built on simple things: family bonds, community ties, and the quiet strength of people standing together. As evening approached, Haynul looked at the time. Despite the ongoing investigation, she had one more stop to make. Mountain View Diner would be serving dinner soon, and Mrs. Lee had promised to save some apple pie. In times of intense work, it was these simple routines that kept them grounded, reminded them what they were fighting for. Commander Sunmei seemed to read her thoughts. "Go," she said with a knowing smile. "The investigation will be here tomorrow. Some traditions shouldn't be broken." Haynul gathered her things, leaving the high-tech command center for the familiar comfort of the family diner. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in their fight against organized crime, but tonight was about maintaining the connections that made their work meaningful. As she drove to the diner, Haynul reflected on how a simple family dinner tradition had transformed into something much more powerful, a symbol of resistance against intimidation, a gathering point for community strength, and a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapons against crime were not guns or badges, but the bonds between people who refused to be afraid. 1 month after the incident at Mountain View Diner, the neighborhood had changed in remarkable ways. The morning sun shone through the diner's windows as Haynul and her father sat in their usual booth, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of their Friday breakfast tradition. Mrs. Lee approached their table with a newspaper in hand. "Have you seen the headlines?" she asked, placing their usual orders in front of them. "They're calling it the largest organized crime takedown in the region's history." Jaiho smiled as he reached for his coffee cup. And it all started right here, with a simple phone call. The newspaper article detailed the fall of not just the Wild Dragons, but 3 other major criminal organizations. Haynewell's cyber investigation had uncovered a complex network of illegal activities, leading to dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions in stolen assets. But more importantly, it had sparked a transformation in the community. The protection network is working better than we expected, Mrs. Lee said, sliding into the booth next to Jaiho. Yesterday, when those suspicious men came around asking about buying properties below market value, Mr. Kim from the grocery store immediately alerted everyone through the new system. Newell nodded, remembering how Commander Sunmai had helped set up the neighborhood alert system. It was a simple but effective combination of modern technology and old-fashioned community vigilance. Business owners now had a secure way to share information and alert authorities about suspicious activities. The prosecutors called this morning. Newell mentioned, spreading jam on her toast. Taiwan and his gang members have accepted plea deals. They're providing valuable information about their connections to larger criminal enterprises. Jaiho listened intently, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Sometimes people just need to see that standing up to intimidation is possible. One success gives others the courage to follow. The diner had become something of a local legend. People came from other neighborhoods to see the place where a blind veteran and his daughter had helped bring down a criminal network. Mrs. Lee had even added a new item to the menu, the Heroes Special, a combination of Jaiho's favorite bulgogi burger and Haynewell's preferred kimchi fries. Commander Sunmi visited regularly, often bringing members of her team for coffee and strategy meetings. The diner had transformed into an unofficial community center where residents shared information and built stronger connections with law enforcement. The business district is thriving now, Mrs. Lee reported proudly. New shops are opening, and families feel safe walking the streets at night. Even the local government has noticed. They're using our neighborhood as a model for community-based security programs. Newell watched her father's face as Mrs. Lee spoke. His expression showed the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found a new way to serve his community. After losing his sight, he had feared becoming a burden. Instead, he had become a symbol of resilience and courage. The bell above the door chimed as Commander Sunmai entered the diner. She was dressed in civilian clothes, but her professional bearing was unmistakable. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Captain Park," she said, approaching their booth. "The chief asked me to deliver this personally." She placed the package in Jaiho's hands. "It's a commendation for your role in the Wild Dragons investigation." Jaiho carefully unwrapped the package, his fingers finding the edges of a plaque. Newell read the inscription aloud. "In recognition of exceptional service to the community, demonstrating that true strength comes not from force, but from courage, wisdom, and unity." Mrs. Lee wiped tears from her eyes as she hurried to get Commander Sunmai a cup of coffee. Other customers in the diner, many of them regulars who had witnessed the confrontation with the Wild Dragons, applauded softly. "We've had requests from other districts," Commander Sunmai said, sitting down with them. "They want to know how we managed to dismantle such a large criminal network so quickly. I tell them it started with a family having dinner together every Friday." Newell's phone buzzed with a message from her cyber team. They had made another breakthrough in tracking the remaining criminal connections. But for now, that could wait. This moment was about celebrating something more fundamental than law enforcement success. It was about the power of community and family. "You know what this means, don't you?" Jaiho said with a slight smile. "Now we definitely can't change our dinner plans. This booth has become part of the neighborhood's security infrastructure." They all laughed, and Mrs. Lee rushed to bring more coffee and her famous apple pie. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the simple scene: a father and daughter sharing breakfast, friends and neighbors gathering to start their day, a community finding its strength. The diner's regular sounds filled the air: the clinking of cups, the sizzle of the grill, the murmur of conversations. But now these familiar noises carried new meaning. They were the sounds of people who had learned to stand together, who had discovered that their greatest protection came not from force or fear, but from the bonds they shared. Commander Sunmi's radio crackled with updates from her team, and Hay Newell's phone continued to buzz with messages about ongoing investigations. The work of protecting the community would never really end, but they had created something special here, a model of how ordinary people, coming together in everyday places, could stand up to intimidation and crime. "I've been thinking," Jaiho said, his unseeing eyes turned toward the window where he could feel the warmth of the sun. "Perhaps losing my sight wasn't just a limitation. It taught me to see things differently, to understand that strength often comes from unexpected places." Newell reached across the table and squeezed her father's hand. She thought about the journey that had brought them here. From his injury in Afghanistan to their quiet dinners at the diner, from her work in military intelligence to her role in protecting their community, every step had led to this moment. "The neighborhood watch meeting is tonight," Mrs. Lee reminded them, refreshing their coffee cups. "People are saying it's the largest turnout yet. Everyone wants to be part of what we've built here." As the morning continued, more regulars filled the diner. Each person who entered greeted Jaiho and Hay Newell, sharing updates about their businesses or families. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was the heart of a community that had learned to protect itself through unity and vigilance. Newell looked around at the familiar faces, the worn but comfortable booth, the sunlight playing on the counter where Mrs. Lee served her customers with pride. Their Friday tradition had evolved into something remarkable. A reminder that sometimes the greatest changes start with the simplest things, like a father and daughter having dinner together, watching out for their neighborhood, one meal at a time.